Welcome to Season 2 of the CANIE Climate Dialogues. And while it may be a brand new season, we still have this same great presenting sponsor. The University of Auckland's International Office is proud to sponsor the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast series. New Zealand is a unique place to think about climate through the lens of their Indigenous cultures. Leading the world's universities in the Times Higher Global Impact Rankings for its first 2 years as they work towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the international team at the University of Auckland share you, our listeners. They share your concerns about climate action and how it connects with international education. The University of Auckland is answering the world's call. And as you know, we are genuinely huge fans of the work that the University of Auckland's International Office does. So we're excited to share that they're going to be on our next podcast episode. But before we do that, let's go to episode 1 of season 2, which feels like a good place to start. So with that, welcome back, or just welcome if you're joining us for the first time, to the CANIE Climate Dialogues. This is the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I'm CJ Tremblay, and it's time for season 2. And what a season it's going to be. In case you missed it, our inaugural season had 10 episodes, ranging from just talking about climate reality to how to do conferences better as an attendee. And we had lots of really great conversations and dialogues, if you will, around the challenges facing our sector. So check that out if you didn't get a chance to catch up over the summer or winter, wherever it is that you are in the world. Now, I'm going to say it. It has been quite the summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. There were some really wild wildfires, some heat waves the likes of the Pacific Northwest has never seen, some disastrous flooding in Europe, and just a few weeks ago in New York and New Jersey. And all of the above were deadly. And all of these were exacerbated by climate change. I know what you're thinking. Oh, wow, what a pick-me-up. I'm so glad I listened to this podcast. I know, but I'm not done, because then on top of all of that, you and I all had to add in what I think most of you listeners had known intrinsically. This was an announcement by way of the new report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was released, highlighting that we are in a code red for humanity. So it was a tough time mentally and emotionally for a lot of people, even though none of this is a surprise. If you're listening to this, you know all this. And I know that all of you, our listeners, would be seeing this and wondering, how can we do better? It's what our sector does. So I was particularly keen to come back and kick off season 2 with an episode that's all about you. I mean, our episodes are always all about you, but this one in particular is an episode that makes space for how some practitioners are feeling in the international education sector. And I want to confess that I saw myself in how practitioners were sharing how they felt. Like when I was hearing about what we're going to talk about today and the research, like I was seeing myself in those answers and feeling, this inaugural episode features a discussion that really had me in my feelings, if you will, which is not a place I often find myself. We welcomed on the podcast a trio of researchers from the Middlesbury Institute of International Studies. Now, some of you listeners who have been with us for a long time might recall the presentation in our inaugural CANIE Summit in May in 2020 about international student climate anxiety. This was presented by Dr. Campbell and Thi Nguyen from the Middlesbury Institute of International Studies. And that presentation garnered so much chatter when it was going on, and it was deeply appreciated by our attendees. So on today's episode, we're going to be welcoming back Dr. Campbell and Thi Nguyen once again, and they will be joined by a third researcher on their team, Maia Stewart, as they share with us the preliminary findings of their research on climate anxiety with international education practitioners. So just like you, so what they did with their students that they presented, a year and a half ago, they've done this research, but for practitioners, right? So it's not just the anxiety about international students, but also the climate anxiety of international education practitioners. So this conversation around their findings was really fantastic and helped put words and data and research behind what I think a lot of us have been feeling, but maybe didn't want to talk about. So a few housekeeping notes before we jump into that, because this is the first episode of the season. CANIE's been up to quite a bit in the last few months, even though we've been quiet on the pod, prepping for the season. CANIE was a finalist for the Pioneer of the Year at the Pioneer Awards, and we wanted to congratulate all of the winners and also take a minute to acknowledge what a scrappy grassroots volunteer-run organization can achieve. And thank you everyone for listening and supporting us over the last little while. And talking about what we can achieve, CANIE's launched chapters. We're officially launching chapters globally. So we've launched chapters in Europe, Oceania, Canada. We've got a few more coming, and we've done that to be able to serve markets with more regionally specific content. So there are also volunteer runs. So we look forward to seeing you join us at some of these meetings or on global working groups. And if you want to get involved, pause the podcast and you can contact CANIE on social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, or our website if you'd like to volunteer. We're always looking for more volunteers to just have more access to resources to do more awareness. And so on the topic of chapters, one of those chapters is actually going to be hosting a virtual event like very soon to celebrate their launch. So if you're listening to us in Europe and would like to join us, please register on the CANIE website. The event is on September 23rd. If you're listening to us after that, you'll be able to hear it on YouTube. And just as a special treat, actually, we're going to start with a brief chat that I had with Caroline, who's the chapter secretary for CANIE Europe, to talk about the event. So welcome, Caroline, to the podcast. Caroline, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Yeah, delighted to have an opportunity to speak to you today.
Where are you joining us from?
Yeah, so I live in Kildare in Ireland, which is just outside Dublin, and I work at University College Dublin in Ireland.
So great to have you here. Caroline is the secretary of the CANIE Europe Chapter, which is awesome. So that's how we know each other. So tell our listeners a little bit about the chapter and how it came to be.
Sure, yeah. So I got involved in the Europe chapter, I think in April this year, when I got an email from Elsa Lamont reaching out to see if I would be interested in joining a group of like-minded people across Europe. And I think Elsa had kind of gathered up the troops of different people who she had been in contact with regularly in Europe and invited us to come to different meetings. I believe maybe a group had formed, but it wasn't kind of official in a Europe chapter sense. So we were just getting started around April of this year. And then different roles were identified as president, vice president, and secretary. And I went for the secretary role, so I was glad to take on that role. So yeah, I helped coordinate our chapter meetings, our documentation, and now we're on to our first event. So yeah, really looking forward to kind of working more closely with chapter members on our first event.
So this is really exciting because CANIE Europe is kind of like our first chapter that came to be all around the CANIE Europe Summit last November. And, we'd all been in touch for a long, long time. And Caroline is not kidding around. She's very well organized and keeps that chapter moving forward. And this event is the first really launch event and sort of your coming out party. So we're super excited to talk about it here. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about when it is, the details, and what they might expect?
Yeah, so we're having our official launch on the 23rd of September, so a couple of weeks now, and it will take place at 3 o'clock Irish time, British time, or 4 o'clock Central European time. It's going to be a 90-minute interactive session on Zoom. The first hour will be a presentations, Q&A, conversation. We'll have some practitioner voices. We'll have some student voices. We'll have input from Elsa as well to give us some context about CANIE Global. And then the last half hour will be a breakout room networking session where people will get a chance to connect with colleagues around Europe.
Most excellent. So if you are listening to this in Europe or you have friends in Europe, and this is an international education podcast, so I have to believe that you do, be sure to check out the CANIE website. The registration link is on our homepage. If you are listening to this after September 23rd and you are like gutted that you've missed this event, we will have a replay, the recording available on YouTube, although you will have missed out on the networking session. But I feel pretty good about Caroline's and the team's commitment to serving practitioners and supporting practitioners in Europe. So I feel like there will be more opportunities there. So
the two practitioner voices and the presentations that will be taking place, one is going to focus on carbon footprint calculators. So Stephen Robinson is going to deliver a short presentation about carbon calculators which are already out there, give some advice on benchmarking, on raising awareness, so that, if you're thinking about how to measure the impact of your work in order to kind of really highlight, what is this doing environmentally and what do we need to change? Because a lot of people aim to start with measuring in order to inform and to change practice. So I think that will be insightful. And the other presentation is going to be given by Scott Blair, and that's on a mapping project which is really focused around study abroad institutions and study abroad students. So really looking at the pre-departure, the travel period, and the return phase. So some real practical tips and resources for administrators to help kind of look at reducing the carbon footprint throughout that student journey. So that should be really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that those two topics are topics that are, people are at different points in their climate journeys and professionally have the ability to implement more or less depending on where they are. So no matter where you are, there will be information for you to take away at this summit, which is also at this launch event, which is also why it will be on YouTube. So if you're listening to this after, you will not have lost the opportunity. And Caroline and the team are certainly going to continue to engage with practitioners in Europe. So any parting words for our listeners before we go and talk to the team in California?
Yeah, I think, if you're looking for somewhere to start and you're looking to really think a bit more deeply about this issue of, how can our sector transform for the better, right? We really value travel, intercultural connections, the human contact, and we really value student mobility within our sector. But how can we also look at how we value the planet and the environment alongside that? So if you're looking to, I suppose, connect with other people who are really interested in that, definitely join us on the 23rd of September. And I think you will leave with a new network and hopefully some new insights as well.
I think that's the perfect way to end it. Caroline, thanks so much for taking a few minutes to hang out with us. And I said this to you before we started recording, and now I'm going to say it on the recording. Your first appearance on the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast, and I hope not your last. And I hope that the next time you will be joining us in the co-host chair. It's very exciting.
Yeah, let's see. Absolutely. And just to say, to register for the event on the CANIE website as well in advance.
Yes. CANIE website is a source of truth for things that are happening. So thanks so much. And we'll chat soon. Okay, so before we welcome our guests today, I just want to give you a little bit more information about each of them. Dr. Anne Campbell is an associate professor at the Middlesbury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, in the U.S. She teaches courses and conducts research on international scholarship programs, international higher ed, student mobility, social change, global warming, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see why she's We're really glad to have her on the show today. She holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota and an MA from the University of Nottingham in the UK. And her co-presenter from last year and partner in research is Thi Nguyen, who is an assistant director of global recruiting at the Institute of International Studies. She's also a recent graduate of the master's program in international education management at that institute. And Thi's research interests include education diplomacy, sustainable education abroad, and equity in higher education. And they are joined this time in conversation with CANIE. They are joined by Maia Stewart, who is pursuing a master's in public administration and a master's of arts in international education management degree at, again, the Middlesbury Institute of International Studies, really just producing a bunch of accomplished practitioners over there in California. So she is passionate about using data to create equitable opportunities for students and professionals. And we are so glad to have all of them here today. It is a real treat. The conversation that we had was incredible, and I'm so excited to welcome them to the show. Ladies, hi. Welcome to the podcast. It is such an honor to have you here. Anne and Thi, we connected at our CANIE Summit more than a year ago. Maia, it is just such a thrill to have you on this podcast. I'm obsessed with this trio. How are you guys doing? Where are you joining from today? Anne?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having us. I am here in Monterey, California.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and I am here in Mountain View, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Wonderful.
I'm excited to be here, and I am in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Amazing, Maia, thanks for that. So I have said this before, I am a huge fangirl of you and your work. And one of the things you guys know we like to hear about is sort of a little bit of background for our listeners about how you came together and what your climate story is. I'm really excited to hearing that from you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take this. So our team has come together based on a mutual belief in international education and international student mobility as a transformational force. And it's something that we've all benefited from ourselves. We also share an interest in social justice and care for the environment. So this team came together about a year ago when we started to really take up some of the questions that our colleagues and students were asking us, which was around why it seemed that climate change and global warming appeared to be mostly ignored in international education. And we wanted our research to really make a difference for future students, for our colleagues, for other researchers. And we thought it was our duty to help steer or perhaps lovingly nudge ourselves and our colleagues to think more about the long-term impact of international education on the planet. So Thi and I started this research about a year ago when we met you, CJ, and that was just about the time the pandemic was beginning in California. And Maia joined the team this spring, and it's been really great for us to have a faculty, staff, and student collaboration on this work. We're all connected to the Middlesbury Institute of International Studies here in Monterey, and we're very grateful to the support from the Middlesbury Institute's Endowment for Academic Excellence and the Joseph and Sheila Mark Faculty Development Fund for supporting this research. And let us explore these questions that we think are important and relevant to the field of international education. So we work hard together remotely during the pandemic, but we also have had quite a bit of fun in this process.
And that's saying something, because this is what we're going to talk about today. These are some big, heavy questions, and there's, this sense of responsibility and care that you guys all have, and I know that can be sort of a lot to carry. So thank you for that work and what you said in sort of your climate story there, where you were getting asked, which was the impetus. I don't know that I knew that before, so it's really interesting that you were getting asked not just by students, but also by faculty and sort of practitioners, which is amazing. So today we're going to talk about that research that builds on that presentation that you guys did in May of last year at our summit. And so just to our dear listeners, if you haven't watched that presentation or been perused the YouTube channel of CANIE lately, I would encourage you to do so. There's a video that Anne and Thi's presentation, and then there was like a Q&A with Eddie West, who still eludes this podcast, but we will get him on, but huge fan of Eddie West. And it's like 22 minutes. So pause this podcast, listen for 22 minutes, go watch, and then come back. So if you haven't done that, you have the power to pause, and then you're going to go learn, and then you're going to come back, because what we're going to talk about today builds on that conversation. So go do that. And welcome back from having done that. So welcome back for having done that. That's great. One of the things I remember the most about that presentation, which I've watched several times because I'm a fangirl, is that when it was happening live, like the chat was going off. Like there were so many comments, and you could like see in real time opening up people's eyes and their like minds and like their hearts a little, which sounds like dorky, but like I just remember like you're really impacting people. And it was perspective that maybe at the time before this conversation has advanced so much, because it's been like, you know, a year and 3 or 4 months, is that it really opened their eyes to this very real phenomenon. Seeing it happen in real time is great. So, and I just wanted to like acknowledge Thi, of who I am a huge fan also, who said something that I literally like point back to all the time, which is like, what does international student mobility even do if it's not mobilizing students to come together and tackle global problems like climate change, which is just like so profound. So I just wanted to like thank you again, and hope that everybody has listened to that and just like recognize how awesome you guys are, and for really saying things that I think maybe aren't said enough in this sector. And I think that exploring that today is going to be really exciting. And one of the things that you mentioned in that session was that you're going to continue building on that research. Here's where we are today. So Anne, please tell me a little bit about your research. You know, it started trying to figure out how practitioners working in international felt about whether going global and going green complement each other or contradict each other. And I'm super keen to hear more about this. So please share this.
Yeah, thanks, CJ, and thanks for those compliments. It was really great to be part of CANIE's conference last year. So the original questions for this study are to better understand how individuals who are working in the field of international education perceive this relationship between international student mobility, or what we refer to as going global, and the environment, or the term going green. So we're interested in their emotions around these two topics and how they relate and the relationship. And then also we want to know if and how they're responding in their careers. So in short, we found that there's no clear answer. Perhaps that's no surprise. And we didn't think that there would be, honestly. We're mostly interested in the qualitative findings and how people are reckoning with this, how they talk about it, and what they're thinking about, as well as the barriers that they perceive. So we interviewed 17 people who work in the field of international education. And of those, 13 of them actually did see and reported a conflict between the ideas of going green and going global, or between working towards helping the planet or mitigating global warming on the one hand, and then promoting international student mobility on the other. Perhaps this is no surprise, but for most of them, it was plane travel or airline travel that came to mind first. So we have a few quotes to share that kind of describe this conflict. And one interviewee said, quote, "I don't think that they necessarily contradict each other, but I can't think of a way where you're accomplishing those both at the same time," unquote. Wow.
Yeah.
Another interviewee said that they felt like it was an ethically icky place to be, to work in the field of international education while also trying to work to preserve the planet. And then another said, quote, "I don't think that there's any industry standard to really address how to hold these two seemingly contradictory things together at the same time."
Okay.
End quote.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, so there's some real grappling in trying to understand how to care about these two things at the same time and to move forward in a responsible fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the same time, however, most people quickly followed that sense of contradiction with a comment like, "It doesn't have to be this way," or "That's how it is now and there's hope for the future." So our interviewees also held the belief that international student mobility is essential for helping us to understand the world better, to seeing examples of how other people live sustainably around the world, and to comprehend how our actions at home influence others, especially those most vulnerable to climate change worldwide. So there is the other side of the argument here, with many of our interviewees saying that they saw complementarity between the two. So, for example, one quote that shows this is, quote, "I think there's a lot we can learn from studying in other countries, and I don't think that people would really think to research those kinds of things about sustainable living or would be able to see them in action unless they've actually traveled to another country," unquote. So it's a complex issue, and some people said that it's both contradictory and complementary. So it's not an either or dichotomy, but lots to explore there in terms of the data. And then I'll just close with one quick comment. One of the more interesting findings is that there is a repeated call among people working in the field of international education for more examples, greater leadership, additional conversation, and more data to really help to understand what's happening. And so kudos to CANIE for putting forward this podcast and other work it's doing to advance the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you for that summary. I think that's really powerful. And we've talked about this, we talked about this earlier when we were preparing, but like, this is really the kind of research where we're researching people's feelings, and we're like getting up in feelings. And so one of the things and these are conversations that aren't really happening, and it wasn't until you said that where it's like, one of the interesting findings is that you're like people are looking for examples and leadership. And so, because we're not talking about it, it can be challenging to be able to, like, now that we're honest about this thing that, it's conflict, we know that we're contributing, and we are all deeply passionate about creating these transformational experiences where people can learn to like perhaps live more sustainably by going abroad, but how do we do it sort of more ethically? So that's really interesting, like research about people's feelings on things. And so I'm excited to talk more into this. So your first presentation with CANIE talks about students, right? A lot about students, and this work is sort of building on that. And Maia, I did want to ask you, I know Anne talked a lot about data, and I know that you sort of live in that space a lot. And so I had a couple questions about climate anxiety, and just making sure that if we could just reiterate sort of, the terms climate anxiety and eco paralysis, and making sure that there's clarity there, but also asking you in terms of your findings for this work, like, does that climate anxiety exist among international education professionals? Because we know it exists among students who are younger, and we know the younger generation are feeling that anxiety, but I'm super keen to sort of hear what you guys found in terms of how the professionals are feeling.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll start with the definitions of climate anxiety and eco paralysis. And I'd like to note that we'd like to acknowledge, although there are many definitions of climate anxiety and eco paralysis, most of our thinking was shaped by Blanche Verlai at the University of Sydney and Sarah Jaquette Ray at Humboldt State University in California. So we define climate anxiety as the chronic emotional distress distress induced by global warming related events that stems from the growing awareness of direct and indirect environmental impacts on individual lives. And eco-paralysis is defined as a mental state of feeling overwhelmed by the complexities of climate change issues and not knowing what to do about it, or meaning an inability to take action. So regarding your second question, so on a professional level, it seemed like participants' anxiety stemmed from a lack of conversation with colleagues, a lack of environmental knowledge, or some level of career-related imposter syndrome. So what we found, and what I mean by that is, so career-related imposter syndrome in this context is participants have actively thought about or they try to take green actions in their personal lives, but in their professional lives, it's been difficult to take similar actions due to a lack of conversation with colleagues or stakeholders. Basically, the conversations aren't happening at their jobs. So if there are conversations, the solutions presented are unattainable. For example, some participants spoke about being presented with buying a Tesla as a solution, or taking public transportation to work instead of driving. And obviously those things aren't feasible for everyone. So this creates a disconnect and a disjointed narrative between who the participant is in their personal life versus who the participant is in their professional life.
Wow. Yeah, that's some real interesting stuff. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just I'm fascinated by this, and thank you for sort of giving these tangible examples of, the solutions being presented, not necessarily matching the big changes that need to happen, causing that sort of syndrome. That's amazing.
Yeah. The career-related imposter syndrome was something very interesting, and I couldn't really think about a concrete definition of it, but I think from after reading all of these interviews, that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, and there's a real, I heard again here, right, the lack of conversations around it. And so I'd be keen to sort of have you expand a little bit about that and what your research. So I know in terms of the implications of the lack of conversation.
Yeah, so what we found is that some conversations about global warming and international education, they simply aren't held because it could be seen as negative. So for example, one participant stated that discussing the topic of going green felt like a threat to the field, especially considering international educators already have to justify why their field is important. And of course, adding on the challenges that international educators face during the COVID-19 pandemic. But it seems like overall climate anxiety is a response that international education professionals experience in our study.
So thank you. And I have reckoned with this, and these conversations and sort of in preparation for this was almost the first time, and I'm just gonna bare my soul, was the first time I felt like there was some research that showed how I was feeling, right? When we talk about this and climate action and climate anxiety and challenging the field to change and transform, I was am I just a Debbie Downer, a negative Nancy? Am I just a pain in everyone's butt? But knowing that there are other people, just for me, knowing that there's this research and talking about other people having that same challenge, because it can be seen as negative. You don't want to be seen as negative in your work, but acknowledging that this is a real piece of people's professional anxiety around their work, I think is really powerful. And so I hope that, people who are listening to this are finding that as well. So I just wanted to thank you for putting this work. And I know that, you guys must as you're researching this, sort of feel almost like meta versions of that, like where you're researching this thing that people are telling you they're worried about because it seemed as negative. Like that is a brave sort of piece to explore and then and bring forward. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and sort of say and like recognize that these are some big pieces from the professional side in terms of conversations not happening. And yeah,
and I think it's also important to have these conversations, but I think research sometimes allows for the space to kind of, take on these challenges and push the conversation forward. Whereas when you're doing the day-to-day work of the field, especially during COVID, it's something easy to put on an agenda for later. So I do think sometimes the research does complement the practice quite a bit.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. Having something to point to that isn't just my feelings, right? Like is something like other people, this is a real thing that is happening, is really powerful. So, we're really talking about some big questions here. And so I do have a big question here, and this is going to go to Thi, who dropped some wisdom bombs for us. So in their previous session, so I'm super keen. But there's a real question, and we ask ourselves this all the time, and it's sort of happening a little bit more, but I'd be keen to hear sort of what, should we continue to promote travel in international education after the pandemic, right? You guys have done some work on that.
All right, thank you, CJ, for the question. It is a big question. It's a very difficult one, and there's no straightforward responses, as far as I know, to this question. Well, in our study, we posed these questions to our interviewees, and all they did was bringing up like a lot of tensions within the field of international education in terms of challenges when it comes to implementing green initiatives in programming. And as Maia has mentioned, climate anxiety and eco-paralysis among international education professionals have not been exactly quantified in current literature, but the feelings, the emotions associated with wanting to do more to help the environment, but like not knowing the right course of action indicate that it's definitely happening, and we all need to acknowledge that. And in our study, we found that our interviewees care about climate change, all of them, and they were dealing with a lot of feelings of discomfort in their roles as advocates and practitioners of international student mobility. And when they are faced with a difficult question of whether, student mobility as traditionally practiced would rebound post-pandemic, we did see a level of them trying to justify their roles in international ed, and most of them came from the participants' personal convictions or perceived responsibilities in relation to their companies and organizations. For example, one interviewer said, well, I might be biased, but I don't think the mobility component will go away. Travel for educational purposes is still a lot better than recreational travel or tourism. The opportunity for students to develop intercultural competence, learn a new language, and acquire personal growth, plus the opportunity for institutions to partner and build a global reputation, hold a lot of value. So they said this, and I was, honestly, I feel for them. I feel for them. I could definitely relate to this, just like the dilemma between the supporting international educations, which has been ingrained in just like my personal purpose, and the responsibility of acknowledging some of the downsides currently, the current downside of the industry. So yeah.
And I think there's a really real point there when you talk about, there's tremendous value in like the people who are in this sector believe in the transformational power of international education, right? Like there's, doing it for the right reasons. Like that's why we've either experienced it ourselves or sort of believe that that's something that is transformational. But like the reality is at the time, that's how it's done, right? There's the travel may not go away, and it may not, but it can be done better. and it can be prioritized. And there's this conflict between the people who genuinely believe in the power of transformational experiences and then people in the sector who just like traveling for work, right? And then there's this ethical piece that I know that I want to hear a little bit more from you in terms of sort of the ethical prioritization of even, you know, people who want to travel for themselves versus prioritizing student travel if we can't get rid of all travel. So I'm keen to hear about sort of the ethical priorities and what your studies show and interviewees shared with you.
Yeah, definitely. That's like one of the main themes of our findings. A lot of our interviewers brought up the tensions between, like you said, the ethical priorities. Well, in our study, in our case, it has to do with, you know, making programs greener, and you know, and there's like a tension between the ethical piece and the financial piece, the financial priorities. Well, in this case, how would you ensure that going green would generate a profit? Because in the end, you know, the end of the day, we're all about keeping the programs running smoothly, making money, bringing in students. So there definitely, you know, financial priorities that, you know, that the field are concerned with. And our interviewees told a lot of stories about how business as usual practices were hard to fight against, as many organizational leaders would not consider taking a strong stance on the issue of climate change or publicly supporting green initiatives because, well, quote, if it costs us time and effort but doesn't bring in significant money, it's not worth doing. So yeah, and we saw a lot of versions of this quote throughout our interview records. And so it demonstrates that there's just a lot of challenges when it comes to implementing green programming. And on another note, there were also concerns that some popular eco-friendly practices, such as offsetting carbon emissions in programs, would lead to even more barriers to participation, especially economic barriers for students. So one of our interviewers said that, well, this practice would penalize certain groups over the others, despite the fact that the students, they are after all not the root cause of the problem. And as a result, they're like, well, we just don't want to exclude students from having equitable access to mobility by requiring them to pay, you know, a carbon offset fee. And as you all know, promoting diversity, inclusion, equity in international education, in education abroad is definitely an issue that is central to our field nowadays. And sustainable programming, I think it wouldn't work if they interfere with existing goals on the agenda of the international education industry. So that's another interesting point that our interviewees brought up.
Ooh. Yeah, I'm not gonna say something, but anyone who knows me isn't gonna be surprised by this, but like, I don't have a lot of time for prioritizing profits at the expense of the planet. Let's just call it that. And so it's amazing that, you know, we've made such progress, and, you know, it's not perfect by any, not even close, but like we made such progress on sort of the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. And there's this like disconnect between the fact that like those things don't matter if it's like climate justice is like, you know, Indigenous justice or sort of justice for less wealthy countries. Those are interchangeable, and you can't really separate them. So yeah, please, Maia.
Something that I have thought about when we were creating the script is, you know, we're now talking more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, we have this issue of global warming and climate change, but it almost feels like, you know, we have this issue and now we're focusing on diversifying our programs, but to take away those programs feels like it's taking away an opportunity for students of color. And so I think that's one of the like conflicts, the major conflicts as a woman of color in this field that I have, especially after doing this research.
Yeah, and thank you for that perspective too, because I think you're 100% right. Like those, it's if we're and they're not easy questions, right? I'm not like, oh yeah, yes, I have all the answers. Like these are difficult questions, and you guys are sort of putting some research that I think is really important so that people have something. And you alluded to this earlier, like pointing to research is so important, and being able to take that and say like, okay, let's start working on these very difficult problems. But climate, I mean, diversity, equity, justice, inclusion, like those pieces are almost disingenuous if the continuation of the practices that we've always had continue to harm people who don't even have access to the international education opportunity. I think, Maya, I think what you're saying is like tremendously powerful, and like all of those programs on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion don't really mean as much to people if it is the case that they're going to continue to perpetuate these systems that cause an unjust distribution of harm as a result of that, or unjust distribution, and people don't even have access to the international education opportunity. So like, thank you for that. I completely I hear what you're saying and like appreciate you sharing that. And so then I'm going to throw to you, because like let's just like casually attempt to solve this problem, or at least say like, whose responsibility is it, right? Like, what was the perspective of your interviewees and the practitioners in the field, and hopefully other people who are like the people who are listening to this podcast? What was their perspective on whose responsibility is this?
Yeah, so it seemed like the interviewees strive to come to terms with the obvious disconnect between going global and going green. They call for more cross-disciplinary collaboration. They believe that the responsibility to combat climate change neither rested entirely on their shoulders nor on the shoulders of other people, and nor could it be executed by them alone. So one of the interviewees said, and this is something that did pop up throughout our research, is, quote, "It's not entirely our responsibility to solve the problem. We're too small of a factor to make a significant difference. It's the corporations, the airlines, the industrial world that should change the most. I'd love to hear more from our environmentalist colleagues too," unquote.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like 1,000,000%, like point to those. There's, what is it, like 100 companies account for 71% of emissions. Like, yes, we are small, and that's so interesting because we are also leaders, right? Like we educate so if there's any industry that has a standard of good practice that is higher than perhaps others, it is sort of the field of education and international educators, like fostering T. Like if we're not working, international students if students aren't working on solving these big global problems, what is even the point of sort of international education? So that's such an interesting perspective that I was like, well, it's not really our problem. We're not the biggest factor, but that's so interesting because we are also leaders. So that's a really interesting thing. Yeah, T, go ahead.
Yeah, but another thing too, that one of the other things I heard from our interviewees was just like the belief that, well, like Maya has mentioned, we could not do all of this alone, and that there should be more collaboration from other fields, and it's kind of a bummer that higher ed is a little bit siloed. And for example, at the Middlesbury Institute, like we have different master programs. We do have an environmental policy program. Yeah, the international education folks and the environmentalist folks barely speak to each other. And we don't have any courses, any interdisciplinary courses. And a lot of our interviewees mentioned that, that might be necessary, that might be some transformation might be executed if we have more help, more expertise, more diverse perspectives on the panel. So definitely, I feel that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thought too when you hear about, you're a million percent right. Like the silos are very real. Like we've talked about that in previous podcasts. We've talked about that sort of in our everyday work where, program development can be done in silos, but also even just like operations. An international office's operations are siloed sometimes from, more often than not always, but from the sustainability office or so there are these silos that exist. And one of the things I would just sort of pose it, and I don't know what it's like in every country, destination country, but I know, in Canada and Australia, international offices have a tremendous amount of power, right? So there is that piece where hopefully they're 100% right. Like it's not entirely our problem to solve. There are these we exist in a system that is perhaps not prioritizing the well-being of planet and people on it. But how do we leverage and harness the power that we do have is one of those big questions. And I love the focus on that sort of justice piece being sort of, if that's a driver of it, good. Yeah, Anne.
And just to underscore points that both Maia and Thi made, I think it's also, it was obvious in our data that it's also a shared responsibility. And so I think we were expecting, or at least I was expecting, to hear more about carbon offsets or things that students would do because they're younger, they're more activists, they're more interested in the impacts on the planet, or at least there's other data that suggests that. But our interviewees did not see it, that it should not be a burden on the students, that it should be a much larger holistic response. So it's complex, and there are some great ideas out there of ways, like Thi mentioned, that the environmentalists and the educationalists can work together, and there's other great partnerships. But this is definitely an area that could use some more thinking and work around it.
Yeah, and so then as we continue this journey with your interviewees, I know in terms of the future, right? We talk about we're going to talk about action later, but in terms of hope, right? In order for you to want to take action, there has to be that hope that we can be better and sort of change. So I would be really curious to hear about, what your interviewees thought of, can we be both what you're talking about, like global and green?
Oh, yeah, thank you for the question. That's another really great question. So for our interviewees, there's a significant number of our interviewees pointed out that, students could achieve a greater understanding of the environmental responsibility by growing abroad. And so examples were mostly drawn from their personal experiences. There weren't any examples directly from their workplace, which is I think that's a very consistent theme. So these examples included students achieving increased awareness of the differences between consumption culture in the US and those of the host countries. So for example, we had an interviewee talking about how French people were more keen on using shopping bags and walking to places. And another interviewee said that there were a lot more categories for sorting trash in Japan, and the collector would just return your trash if it's not properly sorted. So there were policies, there were practices abroad that impress our interviewees in a way, and they brought it up, and they're like, like maybe we could do something like this in the US, in my city, in my hometown. They also acknowledged like the implementation of new eco-friendly practices as a direct result of study abroad returnees applying what they learned from host countries, such as like composting or incentive programming. For example, in China, they're giving out free registration for electric cars. So that's another practice that one of our interviewees brought up. And in general, there were a few interviewees who said that environmental responsibilities should be a part of cultural immersion. And I think that this could be seen as a path to bridging the gap between international student mobility and environmental sustainability narratives, as there's a perceived gap between them right now. And yes, and there's a potential solution is integrating environmental learning goals with global citizenship education. There should be more of a human welfare components in the education abroad curriculum, and that could be linked to the environmental justice piece. And I'm going to let Anne expand more on that, but that's one of the many potential solutions that our interviewee suggested.
Yeah. Okay. So that's so interesting so I guess when I asked that question, I was wondering, how they thought can the experience, it sounds like the experience can be global and green, provided that the educational component is focused on sort of these sustainability elements, or priming students to seek out more sustainable elements when on sort of that mobility experience, as opposed to sort of just being how can we change mobility itself and the nature of mobility to be more green. So you can be more green, the focus, or at least from your interviewees, it sounds like, was prioritizing or sort of seeing it more clearly in the educational programming component. That's really interesting. I've not had the privilege of going abroad for school. When I was in my undergrad, that was not something I did, but my MBA was, and I've talked about this a lot, the shame I feel for the carbon footprint of my MBA, where it was a lot of abroad experiences. There, not once did I hear anything about sustainability in these other countries, or keeping an eye out, or what could we learn, or prioritizing that learning opportunity. Not a single time. And this was in 2018. It's not that long ago. So there's really something to be said for, yeah, it's true, because we're probably not even close to optimizing that right now. And then on, the next step in the journey perhaps is that greater transformation of how do we do an international mobility experience, perhaps with a reduction in sort of that carbon emission point. But that's so interesting. So there is hope, and we're seeing a path from your interviewees, which is good, because I know we talked about climate anxiety and eco paralysis, but in order to power through any paralysis and focus on action, and we talk about this a lot, and what can we do about it? What can a person do about it, an institution do about it? Did your research give any ideas on that?
Yeah, thanks for this question, CJ, because I think this is really important to keep in mind hope and ways forward to improve the situation, or otherwise we just get bogged down and paralyzed ourselves, right? So our interviewees actually did make some great suggestions to move forward, and we have a few to share with you that were mentioned by several each. And they really were asking for tools and actions that would help them in their work. So again, not in their personal life, they've got that pretty well covered, but in trying to advance these issues and concerns professionally. So whether that's in advising students or planning programs or strategies or other ways. So I have 5 for you. I realize this is kind of a list, so I'll try to not
I
take
love
too long.
lists. I love lists. Let's go.
Okay, great. So for the listeners, you can put this in your head in an orderly fashion. So first, perhaps this is obvious from kind of how we conducted this research, but the interviewees noted that it's important to acknowledge that these emotions around climate change are happening both in self and others, including students and colleagues. And so, the recommendation was to make space for it and bring it up when advising students who are thinking about international student mobility, talking with colleagues about it, promoting the idea and discussing it with leadership, And then also understanding that perhaps eco-paralysis is happening and making it challenging to discuss. These are not easy topics. So being patient with the process to some extent, or at least being sensitive with the process.
Got it. Acknowledging and being sensitive about it.
Yeah, and being patient with yourself. Yeah. Second, and this was a bit of what Thi mentioned before. So our interviewees also suggested embedding and incorporating environmental responsibility, environmental action into international education. So this could be in terms of global citizenship. This could be in terms of living sustainably or traveling sustainably. This is tied closely also with social justice and social awareness. So all of this could inspire climate action and awareness, both while participating and after. And so really looking at the links in a systematic way of embedding these practices and ideas into the curriculum and into the practice.
Beautiful. Number 2, embedding. Got it. I don't have space for like that many words because I was like, I'm just going to remember these one words. I'm going to have 5 words.
I appreciate it. Great. So then third, most of our interviewees were middle management level. And what they asked for was advice on how to pitch these concerns to their superiors and other leaders in the field. And that's also meant in the professional organizations. So they felt that previous attempts had been most successful when they talked about things that were not only good for the environment, but also saved money or time. So while it would be wonderful to prioritize the environment in our decisions, and I think as we have hinted at before, this would be our preference, but it seems that the most effective arguments and the ones that are really driving change at this time do align with either saving time or money. And again, given the reality of COVID and the impact on the field, that was also frequently mentioned as perhaps a more pressing priority, along with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Got it. Okay. So now we're like advice or resources around case building. Okay.
Great.
3. Okay.
And then on to number 4. This is more of a tool, and the request was for a calculator or a guide that is helping administrators to understand how to save carbon in the field of international education. And this was meant so people could have the data and then use it to advise students or colleagues or to work this into long-term strategic plans. So for example, our interviewee suggested they would like to be able to answer questions such as, is it better to recommend that students study closer to home, or should they take fewer flights to their destination, or should we recommend that they don't return home during break? So understanding exactly what is contributing the most to carbon and how to make the biggest impact by using data and then some kind of calculator to help to understand that.
This is so exciting. I didn't know. Okay, I did not know that the 4th one was going to be that, because that is something that CANIE is working on. You heard it here first. Now we really have to do it because we've got a working group on specifically like how to use carbon calculators in international student mobility. So great. Well, it's going to be like a delight to be able to help you guys with that.
That's wonderful to hear, because there is a demand in the field to use those tools or use those tools more. Yeah.
On it. Got it.
Great.
On it.
Wonderful. And then 5th was that interviewees also suggested that international education has to get outside of its silo and think about how it can leverage or contribute to larger social movements and specifically to put pressure on the airlines. So this is, for me, this was quite shocking because I think, as was mentioned earlier, I live in those silos of higher ed. And to me, international student mobility is a subset of education. However, I thought it was a really fascinating point of thinking of international student mobility as a subsection of international tourism and aligning with different forces that are working around climate activism in that space. And I think it's something that we as a field could really think about as the globe recovers from COVID and begins to travel again. How can we use our collective voice to join others in an alliance to try to affect airline travel?
Wow, alliances and advocacy. That's awesome. I think that I probably feel the same, delightfully surprised by that. Like, there's no surprise that, we all sometimes work in silos, like what you're talking about, but to have people acknowledge that, well, if we flip things upside down, I think we could do something different here and like use the power. Like I go back to this a lot, like the power that our sector has to influence both, international as a subsection of international education in an institution is powerful. So being able to sort of move the institutions, and there's some examples of that we're working on for future episodes for people to sort of hear exactly that. How is an institution, how is international education working within its institution to push the institution forward to work with regional group or an association that might be advocating for greater change. So that's really awesome. Okay, so I feel really good about those 5 action points. Hopefully, what we're going to try and do is like summarize those as well. And so for everyone listening, I just wanted to say thank you for your time, and I wanted to sort of acknowledge like how powerful this discussion has been, and we're really like pushing people to think differently, but we're also, I think what your work has done is really help people see that they're maybe not alone, right? Like we're all feeling, it's like all up in our feelings today. And so that there's power in that, and when we're not alone. So I just wanted to see if you had any sort of parting thoughts and parting words in terms of either sort of your hopes or what you're particularly proud of about this work, or what you guys are looking to do next. Sort of what excites you about sort of what now, because this is the first look at some pretty exciting research. I mentioned that in the intros. It's some brand spanking new research. So like, what excites you about what this could mean? Talk about your feelings for a minute. All right, Maia, tell me about your feelings.
I guess as a student, it was actually kind of interesting when I started working on this project. I was ending another project with Teens of Color Abroad, and then started working on this project, learning about, like I talked about before, DEI and global warming and how those are in conflict as well. And I think like as this project progresses and as I finish my degree, it makes me want to kind of speak up in class more and challenge my professors about like how we are learning about these green actions and the actual disconnect there is between international education and I guess like environmental education. It makes me want to challenge them to add that to our courses, to add that to our discussions. Even if we talk about it for a day, I think it needs to be acknowledged more, because personally, I felt like it hasn't been acknowledged enough.
Amazing. And as a like young, smart woman, I think it's like really like what you're talking about. Like, I want to speak up more and I want to challenge more. I was like, well, a huge part of what we say in the sector as practitioners is like, well, we're going to take our cues from students. Like, if you can be sort of brave and challenge your professors, which is a dynamic of power that is not necessarily, even. I think that, if students are doing it, and you, Maia, like when you talk about doing that, I'm like, yeah, well, then I'm going to do it too. So like, I think that that's really sort of powerful. So thank you. That's a really great sort of parting word of wisdom to our listeners who do have power and who can sort of maybe challenge even more upwards. And Thi.
Yeah, like for me, like now that I recently graduated, so I'm no longer a student, but I'm still working for the Middlesbury Institute as a staff member. And I think that in my position right now, I will definitely like try to advocate for more interdisciplinary collaboration between departments, between students from different majors. Like specifically at Middlebury, I feel like we do have a lot of resources for the educators and the environmentalists to collaborate, but currently we do not have the the space to for them to, to talk about the same issues or to build themselves toward like common goals. But I think that's necessary. We need their support. We need their expertise. A lot of our interviewees express like some frustration when it comes to trying to implement like green initiative and not really knowing like the full extent of like not really knowing what they're doing. They're just, for example, like, oh, we can like offset carbon emissions, like, charge people a fee in order to go abroad. But at the same time, like, would it help just to like have a price tag on, on travel? Like, we're not really doing anything. In the end of the day, we're still traveling and we're still, polluting the environment. And so I would be curious to hear from the environmentalists and hear about like what would be the advice for us, and what would be some of the more scientific knowledge that we should know, that we should implement in our field. So that's definitely something that that I would try to get involved in. And we might, I don't know, maybe we might make this a comparative study and interview and international environmental policymakers and see what they have to say, and maybe try to find something to bridge the gap between the two fields.
That's great. I love that so much. And I think that's a very real, I think Maia alluded to it a little bit with the imposter syndrome. And like, I know, like, well, I'm not an environmental like expert. So how can I advocate for these big transformations that I know are necessary because we're not carbon neutral, we're not carbon negative, and we know that's what we need to be, but I don't have that science background. So I think that's like, you kind of like nailed it. You're like, there's this feeling, and so and being able to point to anything that can sort of give us that piece. And I know that's a big part of what CANIE is trying to do. So, and I think that what you guys have done, even just from a practitioner standpoint from just on the practitioner side, is like super powerful. So next up, the intersection with environmental. Cool. And to you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks. I think this research reminds me of that old adage about how all research is really me search, and it's like trying to understand yourself better and yourself in the world better. And I read a quote earlier about how it feels kind of like an icky place to be in the field. And I think, personally, having some of those feelings around eco paralysis and guilt and concern about promoting something and teaching in a field that I hold very dear and think is very important. And then at the same time, wondering if I'm also promoting something that is dumping a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So that is, I think for me, it's also helped to kind of grapple with some of those personal feelings. But what I wanted to add is that when we as we've been taking on this research, we've really been looking for others in the field and how they've been thinking about this and grappling with this. And I think I've drawn just as much or more from conversations with Maia and Thi and working together, across time zones and across our different power levels and relationships over the years at the Middlesbury Institute, to really learn from them and hear how they perceive it and what they're experiencing and what they're realizing from their perspectives. And I think it's really enriched our process to have the three of us working together and different perspectives and ideas. So I think together we are getting more and more comfortable of talking about these really difficult issues and trying to figure out how to grapple with it and move it forward. But it's not been easy. So hopefully there's a contribution to others thinking and ways forward and being in kind of this icky space.
Dr. Ann Campbell, as always, just like leaving us some real, just beautiful words to end on. And these like, I'd not heard that before. As I've said before, I'm not a researcher, but like the me search, it's like, I processed a lot with you guys today. And I hope that our listeners did too, but I just wanted to end on a note of like, deep gratitude for you taking the time and the work that you have done. I'm just like such a huge fangirl. And so please come back anytime you just want to have anything you want to talk about, process, share, just kind of open standing invitation to the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast for the three of you. So I just want to thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
The CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast is engineered by Diego Mendez, who is based in Vancouver. He edits these episodes together, making us look and sound super professional. And also, he uploads these episodes to wherever you listen or watch this podcast.